History of Persia is a Hopful Media podcast production.
Doctors take Field of Greens for their own health. Here's Dr. Ryan Green to explain.
We're like you, too much fast food and not enough exercise. That's why I take Field of Greens. The fruits and vegetables in Field of Greens support my heart, lungs, kidneys, and metabolism for weight loss. And Field of Greens promises your doctor will notice your improved health or your money back.
Get 15% off with promo code HEALTH at fieldofgreens.com. That's promo code HEALTH at fieldofgreens.com. Product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Not the History of Persia. This post is actually going to be the first episode of my new series, America Secret Wars. This is not replacing History of Persia. This is not superseding History of Persia. See yesterday's announcement episode for more details. I won't be posting every episode of Secret Wars to the History of Persia feed, because I find it annoying when other podcasts do that. But just to try and get some of you to join me over in the main Secret Wars feed, I will be cross-posting the first few episodes. I do try to stress this in the episode itself, and I have issued several warnings now in the History of Persia feed, but this episode is flagged as explicit for a reason. I am not censoring the language used in this show, so if cursing is something you're not comfortable with or you don't want to hear me doing, do not listen to America Secret Wars. So, here we go. This show is a Hopful Media podcast production. Hello, everybody! Welcome to America Secret Wars, the podcast all about the forgotten and overlooked times the United States has sent military force to fight or occupy foreign soil. I'm your host, Trevor Cully, coming to you from the future. This is part 2 of our episode on the First Oconee War. You may remember from part 1 that I did not originally write this or record it as a two-parter. It just ended up being much longer than anticipated. So I am recording this introduction after the fact to get you back into the episode. I am also aware that there is a discrepancy in the audio quality and the background static between these future Trevor recordings and the episode itself. It turns out that the plug for my microphone was dying while recording these episodes. So that will probably carry over into the second pair of episodes for Secret Wars and should be resolved going forward. Just an FYI. We left off with Alexander McGillivray representing the Muskogee Confederation in their negotiations with the state of Georgia, backing out of a pledge to attend several treaty meetings, resulting in several treaties between the United States and the Muskogee, as well as the Cherokee, that didn't really end up doing anything. So now we'll jump back in with my guest for these episodes, Asha from the Swords, Sorcery, and Socialism podcast, to continue the story of the First Oconee War. These failed treaties led to the Franklinites burning that Cherokee town I mentioned earlier, forcing Dragging Canoe and the Chickamauga to the negotiating table, which only secured peace in the West for a few months. But Alex McGillivray just resumed the fight against Georgia immediately, with more raids continuing throughout 1786, and this really irritated some of the most prominent Georgians. You see, Basically, as soon as the 1783 treaty with the Muskogee was signed, people had started coming up with plans for what they were going to build in the Oconee River Valley. Of course, a fertile river in the 18th century had one main purpose: clear-cut the forests of traditional Muskogee hunting grounds and turn the land into a series of giant slave plantations just as they had along the coast. Once again, fortunately, nobody has ever tried to clear-cut the forest to oppress black people in the Oconee River Valley ever again. Don't look up where Atlanta is.
Yeah. I was gonna say, and I'm sure that's gone well.
Yeah. The thing is, all this timber would have to be used for something. And just a few months before the first raids of the Oconee War, the Georgia General Assembly had granted a charter for the University of Georgia, with plans of building it further north on the Oconee in the place that is now Athens, Georgia. Part of the reason that Georgia was so desperate for the Treaty of Galveston to work was because in 1786 they had also approved plans to build a new state capital in this territory. Both plans had to be delayed for years.
So you said that, they're going to clear cut all of it to build the University of Georgia, which makes sense. My other guess was going to be that they used all the clear cut lumber to, build the Atlanta Braves Stadium so they could go on being racist to indigenous peoples that way through the Atlanta Braves Stadium.
Yeah, this does cast the Braves in a whole new context when you put them here.
Sure does. We're not going to talk about the little, like, the fucking chop that the Braves fans do and, being called Braves on Oconee land in Georgia. Anyway.
Yeah, not a great look for them. Like, at least Florida, they've got the Seminoles, but they have, like, a deal with the Seminole tribe. They get a cut of merchandising. They're fine.
Yeah, they literally made, like, they made a legal agreement with the Seminoles to be called the Seminoles. I don't think the Atlanta Braves have done such a thing.
No. And, like, and they're the team named like that that's got the best name. Like, at least Brave is a bit like calling yourself the Warriors or the Spartans or
the Vikings,
the Trojans or whatever. Yeah, like, it's a class of warrior. That's how we name sports teams.
But
I was in Washington while they were renaming the DC football team.
Yeah, the Commanders. Oh boy.
It's better than what they were before.
Sure is, but this is a slight tangent, but I'm the guest and that's my job. Because we're talking about this naming thing reminded me. In my, this, I don't know, might dox me mildly, but in the high school conference that I was in, there was a high school whose mascot was the Indians. And they had a thing where every year one of the cheerleaders would like try out to be essentially be the head cheerleader, who got the honor of being Princess insert indigenous name here. Sort of like the U of I used to have like a Chief Illiniwek. This high school had a Princess insert indigenous name here. And so then at basketball games at like halftime, when the cheerleaders performed, she would come out in like the getup. That was a thing the high school in my conference was doing in the early 2000s.
Oh, yeah, listeners, you don't see the video, but I was just mouthing bigger oh no's as that story progressed.
Yeah, this was as late as 2008 when I graduated high school. They still had a princess. I'm not going to say the names. I don't entirely dox myself, but they had a princess, which is obviously a white cheerleader, as late as 2008 at their basketball games. So I think they got rid of it around the same time that U of I got rid of doing Chief Illiniwek, to be fair. So probably around the time out, in the late 2010s or whatever, early 2010s.
Yeah, you started that with the doxing concern, and I was like, oh, Asha, you don't have to worry about that. Everybody's got a team with that name. But no, that just got worse and worse as you went on.
No, it's a very specific name. It's also the name of the high school. So...
Whew. That's great. Yay, America.
America. All right. So back to our Braves.
Fuck yeah.
back to the land estate, the new capital of Georgia trying to be built on a Coney land.
Yes, well, both the plans for the University of Georgia and their new state capital had to be delayed due to becoming an active war zone. As fighting escalated, Spain was obligated by the Treaty of Pensacola to supply the Muskogee with weapons, but deliveries were becoming less and less frequent and less organized. So Alex traveled in person to New Orleans and sent 2 of his lieutenants to Pensacola and St. Augustine, basically each of the main Spanish capitals in North America, to try and get Spain back on board. And back on board they got. Kluwali, the Muskogee representative sent to Pensacola, had the most immediate luck. He had a letter from Alex requesting 300 pounds of gunpowder, 6,000 pounds of shot, and 200 flints for their rifles from the governor of Spanish East Florida. The governor wrote back to McIlvray, "You may rest assured that I will continue attentively giving powder and balls and other presents for the Indians as formerly for their hunting, and even larger quantities of ammunition to whoever gives me a letter from you for the purpose."
He just said, "Yeah, sure, bro, here you go."
Yeah. Translation from Spanish to English to actual English. As long as Alex sends me a letter, I'll give you as many guns as you fucking want.
You're shooting Americans with them? Oh yeah, here you go.
Yeah, the Spanish really didn't want the Americans to start looking too closely at their white neighbors, or for their own colonists to start thinking about this whole independence thing. Meanwhile, the Muskogee warriors were continuing to fight against the Georgian militia, now under the command of respected Revolutionary War hero and giant asshole Elijah Clark. Why do I know he's an asshole? Because he's a wealthy guy in Georgia in the 1700s.
No, there was like one good founding father, and he went to France to go be in the French Revolution because his name was Thomas Paine. And then he was doing so much French revolutioning, he got put in prison in France.
Look, I'll give credit to, there's a couple of New England guys who we don't ever hear their names, and Ben Franklin, who at least learned from some of his mistakes. He learned some life along the way and freed all his slaves. Like, if you're not starting out in a good place, that's the best you're gonna get from somebody who at some point owned slaves in the 1700s.
Yeah, that's fair.
And he fucked half of France, so it's fine.
No, it's
not.
Thomas Paine also fucked half of France, but in a completely different way. by aiding and abetting the French Revolution.
Yeah, they're in the process of working up to that while all of this is going on.
Mm-hmm, exactly. So the Spanish are like, "Yo, dog, we got you."
Yes, dog.
Yo,
literally.
mad dog, we got you.
Yeah, because Mad Dog was back out in the field this year, and he and his war party found more individual white settlements in Oconee County, or in Oconee Territory, but they found fewer actual settlers. That's because, as it became clear that this was about to become more of an actual war, colonizers turned refugees were pouring into Augusta, Georgia at a rate that scared the state government so much that they reached out to the illegal state of Franklin to plan a joint strike against the Muskogee. Remember, Franklin was officially an illegal settlement and had a strong separatist movement going at the time. That alliance never materialized because the Chickamauga started raiding Franklin again, so Elijah Clark was left to raise the local militia, but he simply didn't have the resources to do much more than defend existing settlements along the Oconee River itself. As both tensions and casualties rose, Haboithle Miko and Enea Miko both declared neutrality for the towns under their leadership, because they had sort of inadvertently started all of this in the first place, and that gave Daniel Murphy, the head of Georgia's Indian Affairs Committee, the ability to establish an outpost inside Muskogee lands at a trading stop called Shoulderbone Creek. Daniel was a freakish mutant with blonde hair, so the Muskogee just called him Yellow Hair, even in official correspondence with the state of Georgia.
Hey, Yellow Hair, wait, what's up?
Yeah, just, at this point, that's less of a standout feature, probably. But imagine being the first Native American person to see a dude with blonde hair.
Like, the fuck is wrong with you?
Right? He's not an albino, but he's almost an albino? I don't understand.
I don't get it. To be fair, that is that's middle school, guy naming conventions where you're just like, what's your most outstanding feature? That's your name now.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Your glasses, you're blondie, you're ginger. You gotta bother with names.
Middle school guy, soldiers, sports teams.
Yeah.
All roughly the same bracket.
Yeah.
All right. While this was going on, Alex McGilvray convened another war council to plan out the next phase of operations at Tukabachi. So in October that year, Daniel Murphy managed to convene a peace council with some of the Muskogee tribal and village leaders, with Haboithle Miko acting as the mediator, meeting with the kind of Congress of the Muskogee where in the same town where they had the war council. Or no, not in Tukabachi, at Shoulderbone Creek. However, it wasn't exactly a fair negotiation. Elijah Clark arrived with the state militia, and the Muskogee headman had to walk between two armed companies in parade formation just to get inside the fort. It was also a pitiful turnout of only the most exhausted and already pro-American Muskogee leaders. They were confined to the fort, surrounded by militia, and essentially had no meaningful leverage to negotiate without Alex McGilvray in the room. They were forced to confirm the land ceded in the Treaty of Augusta and leave 5 of their own as political hostages in Georgian custody, knowing full well that the war against Alex and the rest of their people would continue and endanger the lives of these hostages. The heavy-handed approach made Haboithle Miko a laughingstock among his more militant peers, and burned any lingering goodwill the Muskogee partisans had left towards the state of Georgia. The thing is, the Shoulderbone negotiators had fundamentally misunderstood their opponents. They spent the following winter bragging about how they had secured peace along the Oconee, but when James White, an agent of the new Indian Affairs Committee from the federal government, traveled down to meet Alex, he found the Scotts Creek warlord in the middle of a war council. Also, could you possibly get a better name for a literal agent of American colonialism than Agent James White?
Old Jimmy White over here.
Yeah, just
I'm Jim White, and I'm here to say that you indigenous peoples, you're supposed to be done fighting now. I said so.
Well, in this case, it's more like, oh, you guys are still fighting. I gotta go talk to the Georgians. They may have gotten some facts wrong.
Might have fundamentally misunderstood what was happening here.
Yeah. So Jimmy White delivered a prepared speech to the assembly that he probably found pretty outdated by the time he was giving it, only for the gathered Muskogee leaders to interrupt him mid-sentence and ask if he was there to take...
Just throwing tomatoes and shit at him.
And they asked if he was there to take more prisoners. The Georgians had taken their hostages in the long-standing tradition of Old World politics, where nobles are held in relatively comfortable captivity to ensure their people's good behavior. To the Muskogee, it looked like several of their leaders had been taken as prisoners of war, and the families of the captives wanted to take them back by force. Because that's the sane and rational version of that transaction.
They actually more understand what's happened.
Yeah. Yoholo Miko, the chief presiding over this war council, told Agent White very directly that the only obstacle to peace was the white seizure of Muskogee lands. The Georgians could fuck off or find out. It wasn't a complicated war. But they were also willing for Agent White to get back to them with peace terms before resuming their attacks. Just a compromise.
Yeah, our compromise is we'll let you go talk.
Come back with our people and a peace deal, and we'll see where this goes. That peace lasted all of a month because in early April 1787, Shiupki Hutki, one of the hostages in Augusta, Georgia, hung himself, which was announced publicly in the Georgia State Gazette with a poem. Oh, I'm gonna read it.
Oh no.
The probable cause of such unnatural flight to the land of spirits we may attribute to insanity, but where the soul knew no control, and liberty made all men free, no chain could bind a savage mind. Through leathern string it took its wing to regions where imagination tells how Christians live and where this savage dwells.
What?
It's very 18th century language, and it's not overly clear if it's mocking Shiupki Hutki or mourning him. I literally do not know.
You know, from our perspective, it seems mocking, but like it might not have been back then.
Right, it's not super mocking language and wording, but also you announced the suicide of a political prisoner with a fucking poem in the newspaper. Like, I don't know what they wanted to come out of this.
Oh my God.
Also, if anybody corrects me on Twitter or wherever the hell else we're doing social media by the time this comes out about the past tense of hang, I hope you get your hair stuck in your eye for hours, because that is undoubtedly the dumbest fucking distinction in the English language, and it doesn't even make sense. The past tense of hang is only hanged when you're killing a person. That's the dumbest shit.
Oh, God, what a stupid language we have.
They're all dumb, but ours is really fucking dumb.
To be hanged. Hung. Hanged.
I was about to make an ad transition, but I think we should probably get a little more through than this suicide.
No, you know who else will, who will announce your death with a poem? The sponsor of this program.
Okay, that word. See, I don't want to just outright copy it, but they are the best ad transitions out there. Like,
yeah, they are. I mean, Robert's good at what he does. He's like, and you know who else?
Well, and it's the whole, like, there's no natural way to do this.
No, there's really not. There's no natural way to be like. Also, capitalism.
When I was applying to grad school, in just one visit to a prospective department, my roommate and I kept track of all the languages we had been told we needed to learn to study ancient Persia. The final tally came to 27 relevant languages. As somebody overwhelmed by Greek, Latin, and the need to pick up French and German, that was a bit terrifying. Reading mostly dead languages is different from speaking them, but just picking up a new language in any context is daunting. Fortunately, Rosetta Stone is the most trusted language learning program, available on desktop or as an app. It truly immerses you in the language you want to learn. I've had more than a few times where I wished I knew modern Persian. Rosetta Stone has been the trusted expert in language learning for 30 years and built up a catalog of 25 languages to learn, all available through their lifetime membership, which you can get today for 50% off. Not all of them overlap with that list from grad school, but many do. Hebrew, Persian, Latin, German, and Russian, just to name a few. Rosetta Stone has no English translations, always the part I found most frustrating, and instead focuses on long-term retention through an intuitive process of working up from simple words to full sentences. Don't put off learning that language. There's no better time than right now to get started. For a very limited time, History of Persia listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership for 50% off. Visit rosettastone.com/today. That's 50% off, unlimited access to 25 language courses for the rest of your life. Redeem your 50% off at rosettastone.com/today today. And we're back. Ah, fuck, Asha, you can't say that.
Death Poems by Raytheon.
Yeah, we were just talking about the high schools you had growing up named after slurs.
Yeah, there's a high school in my conference that basically had a slur in its name. And yeah, people forget how comfortable with this we were until incredibly recently.
All right, now that we've had a good laugh, back to that suicide.
So how did the rest of the Muskegee people take the rhyming suicide of a hostage?
They took it great. 2 men from Shiupki Hutki's family abandoned the truce with Agent White, crossed the Oconee River, killed 2 settlers near Shoulderbone, acquired 14 horses, that's the phrase my source used, and brought an escaped slave home with them.
Yes. Amazing. Fantastic. I'm frequently known to acquire nail polish at Target. So
yeah, acquired 14 horses, that's just cattle rustling. You can just call that theft. That's okay.
We're just rustling.
As soon as word of this fairly minor attack reached Augusta, Elijah Clark dispatched the militia, who gunned down the first 12 natives they saw on the western side of the Oconee. These 12 were a hunting party from tribes that had agreed to the Shoulderbone Treaty.
Of course. You knew that was coming, right? As soon as they're like, we signed the treaty, we're the good ones. That's not going to work out for you.
Oh yeah, it's cool shit. And again, they'd fundamentally misunderstood the war they were fighting. Because from the Muskogee perspective, those 2 family members were exacting blood retribution on people who had killed their relative.
Yeah.
From the American perspective, they were violating a peace treaty. They had fundamentally different understandings of what it meant to be at war.
Fortunately, this is the last time the U.S. will fundamentally misunderstand its adversaries or what their objectives or how they fight wars is.
Yes. See how we really understood how communism worked for about 100 years.
Or how good we are at counterinsurgency tactics.
Oh, the best. That's why we beat the Viet Cong. we can't even take that seriously. It's so fucking sad.
Look, to be fair, nobody beat the Viet Cong.
That is true.
Not the French, not the Americans, not the Chinese.
Now, the only force that ever beat the Viet Cong was American capitalism in the form of actual goods and services, not guns. Going
full, civilization, cultural victory instead. But anyway.
That is our plan, I think. So, to their credit, though, not all of the Georgia militia were wanton murderers. One company of Georgia volunteers just outright refused to cross the river on the basis that their volunteer status was for defensive action only.
Early Union contract says right here, I don't have to cross the river. If you want me to cross the river, you got to talk to my foreman.
This is not the last time this issue will come up with militia and or National Guard units. Because If anybody's wondering, before I get to a whole episode on it, have a look at what percentage of forces in Iraq during the war in 2003 were National Guard.
Oh boy, that's a lot.
It's like 40%.
Uh-huh.
Whether this was moral opposition, simple cowardice, or more likely a mix of both, we just don't know. Another company that did cross the river encountered a hunting party that wasn't aware that the war had resumed yet. The company commander wanted to execute all of the Muskogee captives on sight. But he was stopped when one of his militiamen threatened to shoot any man who tried to harm the hunters. This was an act of treason from a man holding a musket. He could shoot one man who tried to harm the hunters before being gunned down by the rest of the company. But it fucking worked.
Hey, if that one man that you're going to shoot is the company commander, that could be all you need.
Whoever it was, anonymous militiaman number 12 had stones. Now, up to this point, only Alex McGillivray and the Muskogee had really been treating their conflict as a war, despite mass deployment of the militia. But now Georgia was out in full force. However, the United States at large was dealing with bigger problems on another front. Up north, the United Indian Nations, more often called the Northwestern Confederacy, had launched a much larger war, against the fledgling American Republic the previous year. And in summer of 1787, the UIN sent representatives to meet with Muskogee war leaders and plan a coordinated assault. On the 4th of July, Georgia state legislators celebrating their Independence Day in a coffee house toasted to a truce with land speculation and Indian wars. Meaning, they weren't doing great at either at the time. As far as they were concerned, acquiring land across the Oconee and fighting the native inhabitants were now the same project. Up north, again, Congress was also preoccupied with what they saw as more important matters all summer in Philadelphia. And despite Alex's expressed desire to negotiate with the central government and James White delivering the Muskogee demands, nothing materialized. You see, after a few years of attempting to govern their 13 states as a confederation, the United States had come to a conclusion. The Articles of Confederation sucked, and a confederacy of 13 semi-autonomous states was a pretty shit way to run an expansionist colonial empire with hostile neighbors on every side.
Oh yeah, you need some centralization if you're going to run an expansionist empire, baby.
So, the representatives in Philadelphia were drafting a new constitution, which took all of Congress's attention until mid-September as they tried to hammer out things like, should enslaved people have no voting rights, but also get to count towards the population represented in Congress? And how would having an army work? Because up to this point, the concept of a United States armed forces was really loose, limited to a couple of, dedicated militia companies and some assholes with boats, including...
And also not very popular across the entire concept of the colonies. The idea of a standing army by the central government was not very popular, if I remember correctly.
No, they had kind of fought a war against that just a minute ago. Yeah, and the most famous person in the Navy at this time was off being a privateer in the Black Sea in service to Catherine the Great of Russia.
John Paul Jones?
Yes, John Paul Jones was a pirate.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent song by the Longest Johns. While all of that was going on, it's a busy time for North America. The would-be state of Franklin went to war with North Carolina. So Franklin's at war with North Carolina. The United Indian Nations continued attacking settlers around the Great Lakes, and the Muskogee were solidifying around the consensus that they needed to fuck up Georgia in retaliation for the atrocities committed against their people. So on September 16th, literally the day before the U.S. Constitution was unveiled to the public, a Muskogee raiding party of about 50 men ambushed and killed a Georgian scouting party. That got Elijah Clark's attention, and 5 days later, he and 160 militia tracked down the Muskogee warriors along Jack's Creek, a tributary to the Ocmulgee on the far western side of disputed territory. The militia opened fire just after noon, and they spent the next 4 hours engaged in a firefight with the Muskogee and the militia shooting back and forth with muskets over a creek in the middle of a dense forest.
So lots of people were getting hit.
And,
just kidding.
I mean, I assume the militia are standing in blocks, so probably. But the Muskogee can't see if that's happening, because this is the age of black powder, and they're in a dark forest as the sun is setting.
Just firing blindly into the smoke across a creek. Amazing.
For 4 hours. Excellent battle strategy from Major General Elijah Clark. Not that it's that different from anybody else fighting a war at the time.
True.
It simultaneously sounds like this would have been terrifying and then the most boring battle imaginable after about the first 30 minutes. But by around 4 in the afternoon, Major Clark had started to think the same thing and ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge across the creek, pushing the Muskogee back into the canebrake, disrupting their formation and forcing them to retreat and leave most of their supplies behind. 17 militia and at least 25 Muskogee were killed or wounded in combat. Pound for pound, this was a massive loss for the Muskogee. Their total population at this point was only about 8,000 people. Georgia followed this up with a few new laws in their General Assembly. First, they reestablished a standing state militia for the first time since independence. Then they passed a, quote, an act for suppressing the violence of the Indians, which authorized raising even more militia. But probably more importantly, they spent the end of that year going through the official process of ratifying the new Constitution. Part of the new government's deal was that more centralized authority could mean more military support, and winning the Oconee War became a driving force for getting Georgia to approve the new law of the land on January 2nd, 1788. Their need for reinforcements, even after the Battle of Jack's Creek, was highlighted when the Muskogee forces didn't go home and rest for the winter. The quiet summer months had allowed them to reap a sizable harvest, and all the plunder from raiding settlements more or less unimpeded for 2 full years gave the Muskogee a massive surplus. So they spent all winter raiding the comparatively undersupplied colonists and burned 3 militia forts to the ground, including Greensboro, the main settler trade post in the Oconee Territory. And if you need a trade post, you can listen to this advertisement. You can probably trade money for, I don't know, probably a food box, statistically speaking.
Or a mattress.
BetMGM has an unreal deal for sports fans in Iowa. Turn $5 into $150 instantly when you place your first wager at BetMGM. Simply download the BetMGM app and sign up using code Hawkeye150. Then, place a $5 wager on any sport. You'll receive $150 in bonus bets, regardless of your wager's outcome. And if you think the fun stops there, the king of sportsbooks has plenty of surprises in store. Check out daily promotions, same-game parlays, live bets, and so much more. No matter your team or your sport, BetMGM is for you. Download the app in Iowa today and get $150 in bonus bets instantly from your first wager. Only at BetMGM. BetMGM and GameSense remind you to play responsibly. See BetMGM.com for terms. 21 plus only. Iowa only. New customer offer. Subject to eligibility requirements. Rewards are non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire in 7 days. Please gamble responsibly. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-BETS-OFF.
All right, back to it, because we're very near the end of the script. So, everybody in North America is at war with one another, and the Muskogee are winning in the Oconee. And wars make for strange alliances. Despite reining in the Americans being the whole point of the Spanish-Muskogee alliance, all of this success actually scared the shit out of the Spanish because they were afraid that it would spill over to the Muskogee in their territory. They were right on the border with East Florida, and if the natives were doing so well against Americans, they might do pretty damn good against the Spanish. Plus, the Spanish governors were getting very suspicious of Alex McGillivray and his personal ambition with all of this going on, for reasons we'll discuss in a minute. They did continue supplying the Muskogee with arms and supplies, but they got stingier about it. Fortunately for the Muskogee, the secessionist Republic of Franklin was now basically at war with the United States as a whole, and despite also being at war with Alex's Cherokee allies, they made an alliance with McGillivray to fend off the Georgian militia. So to be clear, an American settler breakaway state on openly stolen Cherokee land sided with the Muskogee, who were the Cherokees' allies, to help them fight a war against settler colonialism.
Oh, I love history.
Of course, this only lasted for a few months because, very predictably, the Franklinites attacked and burned a Cherokee town a couple months later, which sent refugees fleeing into Muskogee territory, and Alex had some principles. So, the Muskogee were feeling pretty good about their own position by then, and they led the unified Native American counterstrike against Franklin. This last assault in 1788 was the death blow for the tiny wannabe republic. You would think, with their alliances strained and Georgia calling up more and more militia, this would be a turning point against the Muskogee. But no, the Muskogee Congress and Alex McGillivray forbid their traders from crossing into Georgia to ensure the element of surprise. And it was just one successful raid after another, burning plantations, murdering and assaulting settlers, and successfully skirmishing with militia. I don't want to sugarcoat it. Basically, every raid referenced in Gordon Burns Smith's History of the Georgia Militia includes credible accounts of scalping or killing fleeing civilians, including children and teenagers. But fortunately, no oppressed people having their land actively stolen by settler colonialism would ever rise up and do violent things against a civilian population ever again.
Never. Yeah, particularly not in the year of our Lord 2023.
Don't look at the news. And probably 2024 by the time you're listening to this. I can't imagine that situation will have changed.
I don't imagine so.
So through the whole year of 1788, the Muskogee consistently had a numerical advantage against the militia. Their warriors, hunters in peacetime, were more familiar with the terrain and more mobile, and as the white settlers in the region fell, the Georgians had fewer and fewer supplies at their disposal. The militia were starving, poorly equipped, and too spread out to effectively defend their colonists. This culminated with Georgia's 4th and 6th companies launching mutiny against their commanders and demanding to either go home or get more supplies from the state by mid-1789. Georgia was actively losing this war. The very first war any part of the United States had ever fought.
Oh, beautiful.
Speaking of, rewind immediately following the War of Independence to General George Washington when he had officially disbanded the Continental Army with the exception of 80 artillerymen. basically the absolute minimum needed to maintain the guns that were too big and expensive to just offload onto the state militia. This sounds insane to us today, and even back then, it was more of a ceremonial move to transition from war to peacetime. Congress immediately raised a single standing regiment of 2,631 men, called up from various state militias. The 1st American Regiment was primarily there to act as a corps of professionals for the militia to rally around in times of war, and act as a sort of border patrol, which was a lot less controversial when those borders were British Canada, who we had just been at war with, a ton of hostile and on-the-offensive indigenous nations, who had every reason to be at war with us, but were actively killing American citizens, and Spanish Florida, which was actively arming said indigenous nations.
Little more reason to have a force for the border.
You can see why they might need a border patrol in this specific situation. After Georgia ratified the Constitution, 2 companies of the 1st American arrived in Savannah and made their way inland to the Oconee front. One was an infantry unit, and the other was heavy artillery, which was scary and could have been useful if the newly reinforced American forces reached Tukabachi or one of the other big Muskogee towns. But it was pretty much there to look impressive given that this was a guerrilla war in the forest, and artillery wasn't going to be of much use.
Not dragging that through the woods, no.
Yeah, remember, no motor vehicles. You are going to have an ox cart carrying a brass cannon. Fortunately for the US, they immediately learned this lesson and never tried to win a guerrilla war in a forest by deploying scary-sounding heavy munitions ever again.
Never.
Nope, not something we do, like, twice a year. Now that they had both troops and supplies from the federal government, the Georgians stiffened their resistance. American troops moved to reoccupy their forts in the Oconee Territory, increasingly pushing back Muskogee raids that summer, and, so far as they knew, successfully convincing Alex McGillivray to sit down for peace talks at an outpost called Rock Landing in September. The presence of U.S. regulars on the battlefield, or at least the presence of their cannons and funding, spooked Alex just a little bit. Or maybe more accurately, he allowed the Americans to think that he had been spooked. Alex had all but agreed to terms of surrender, including extending U.S. federal authority, but not Georgian authority, over the Muskogee Nation. Then he received a letter from Spanish Florida promising more aid to the Muskogee to continue their fight. U.S. secretaries were actively drafting the final wording of the physical treaty for Alex to sign on behalf of the Muskogee when he got up and stormed out, declaring that they would not lay down their arms until all Muskogee lands were free.
Oh, you're finishing over there? You're almost done? Yeah? Well, fuck you.
Like, you have to assume that this letter was staged, and he was just intentionally wasting their time.
I would imagine so.
Maintaining just enough plausible deniability for them to ask him to negotiate again later. Because following the breakdown of those negotiations, the newly formed United States Senate met in 1790, and one senator wrote, "'Tis a spoiled piece of business, and by way of justification of their conduct, they seem disposed to precipitate the United States into war, the not uncommon fruits of employing military men." And another quipped, "Here's a fine scheme on paper, to go to war with the Creeks because the commissioners, being ignorant of Indian affairs, failed in making a treaty after having spent $15,000 to no manner of purpose."
Yes, even the Senate's like, you guys are fucking stupid.
The United States Senate is looking at the state of Georgia and they're like, what the fuck are you doing with all of our money down there? We only have $100,000.
You wasted our money, and you know so little you couldn't even put together a competent treaty. You morons.
Yeah, and like to give the perspective, $15,000 is roughly a full quarter of the bribe that the federal government was offering to the Barbary pirates that were raiding American shipping at the time. And the pirates turned them down because it wasn't enough money. It was the entire federal military budget. The Senate immediately recognized that part of their problem was sending career military officers to negotiate who knew nothing about the Muskogee and were career soldiers who wanted to go back to war. So the recently elected President George Washington, a man whose father was known as the Town Destroyer by the Iroquois people of the Ohio Valley, invited Alex to come up to New York City, which was acting as the U.S. Capitol, and negotiate in person with the highest echelons of the federal government. Keep in mind, Washington was still actively overseeing another massive war with Alex's native allies in the United Indian Nations. This was an admission by the United States that they now saw the Muskogee Confederacy as a genuine threat to the stability of the Union. The president personally dispatched Colonel Marinus Willett. You don't get names like Marinus anymore.
I was going to say, they don't name him like they used to.
Marinus Willett, who was sent to secretly enter Muskogee territory on his own and deliver a message. In Washington's own words, the people of Georgia were not friendly to peace. If a person acquainted with Indian affairs could enter the country without the knowledge of the people of Georgia, a war might be prevented.
We could do this if the Georgians would just shut the fuck up.
Which is not overwhelmingly different from a lot of other points in U.S. history. Many presidents have had that opinion. Now, never mind that there had already been open war between the Muskogee and the Georgians for half a decade at this point. It would at least prevent escalation. Georgia had just concluded a major scandal known as the Yazoo Land Scandal, where the state was illegally selling plots on land federally recognized as part of the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. Any further escalation with the Muskogee would undoubtedly have led to a Southwest Native Confederacy forming to oppose the United States as well. And keep in mind, when we say West United States at this point, we mean like the Midwest now.
Yeah. You're talking like Arkansas.
Yeah, and that's out there. Alex, Haboifle Miko, Yaholo Miko, and several other chiefs smuggled themselves out of Georgia and went north in 1790 to meet with the American leaders in New York. There, they met George Washington himself, Thomas Jefferson, then the Secretary of State, and Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, a position we had back when we didn't lie about what the Department of Defense was for.
Right.
Though the major figures on both sides met with one another repeatedly, it was really Alex and Henry Knox hammering out the finer details. A major sticking point in the negotiations was the question of indigenous sovereignty, and the 1790 Treaty of New York would go on to set the precedent for both how the United States dealt with Native American nations for most of the following century, and how we still deal with unincorporated territories. The treaty would remove Georgian authority over Muskogee lands and place them under federal authority in the territory claimed by the state of Georgia. This was considered an acceptable compromise. It got the most aggressive elements of state settler policy off the Muskogee's back and provided some well-defined federal authority in the Deep South that would give the federal government sorely lacking legitimacy. This included a provision that the Muskogee would turn in any fugitive slaves who escaped into their territory, which the feds saw as crucial to Georgia accepting the agreement, and the Muskogee leaders knew they had absolutely no ability to actually enforce.
Like, yeah, we'll do that, sure. Be right on it.
Yeah, if we find anybody who tells us they're an escaped slave, we'll be sure to let you know.
Just like looking at your boss. Yeah, you got it, boss. Whatever you say.
If the three of us personally find those guys.
Yeah. I personally see anyone in the process of taking off their chains.
This isn't to say the Muskogee didn't keep enslaved African people as property themselves. They absolutely did, but they were not as formally segregated, let's say. At this point, Muskogee slavery and most indigenous American forms of slavery resembled a lot more like ancient slavery in the old world, where you could maybe buy your freedom or just be manumitted because your owner liked you, or it wasn't strictly racialized, seen as other than human slavery like the American South was starting to develop. Overall, the Treaty of New York was a rare win-win in the history of American fugitive slave policy. It also recognized the Muskogee as a fundamentally sovereign nation with the authority to prosecute and punish non-indigenous trespassers and white criminals caught on their side of the border. The only thing left up in the air was the issue of the Oconee River itself. They should have been convenient borders, but the Muskogee wanted to control both banks of the river. The federal government was able to work out a deal to purchase the East Bank from the Muskogee and give it to Georgia, acting as a border between the state and the natives. But Alex and the chiefs that were with him absolutely refused to cede control of any of the Altamaha River, which was their route to the Atlantic. Washington and Henry Knox decided not to press that issue and left it in Muskogee hands. But the Oconee branches into Three Forks on its northern end, and that area remained disputed. Under the Treaty of New York, the border was at the easternmost fork, but the Muskogee had previously agreed to have joint access to all three as hunting grounds. Failure to secure the region for his people was one of the first dominoes to fall against Alex's influence and image as a premier negotiator among his people. And MacGillivray warned that this issue would cause problems, but Henry Knox wouldn't budge. So it made it into the final treaty, and ultimately Alex didn't seem too bothered by that, and the First Oconee War was officially over.
Ominous.
Yeah, funny how wars with firsts in their names tend to end on shaky agreements.
Yeah, they should stop naming them that way, so we'd stop having new second ones.
And then you have things like the phrase Second World War, which was coined while the first one was still happening. But what gives here? Asha, do you have any idea what Alex MacGillivray, unofficial, unelected, half-Scottish, de facto king of the Muskogee, was up to here? Because just a few months earlier, he was marching out of meetings demanding that there would be no peace until every inch of land was free.
Either he was attempting to do something to shore up his own authority over his people, or he was deeply scared that he was suddenly going to lose access to the weapons that they were using to fight this war. And so he's like, I'm doing a treaty now because I'm reasonable. And it's actually because he was worried they were about to lose all of their money and guns.
See, those are the types of schemes he would want you to think he was engaged in.
God, I've fallen for the classic trap.
Because Alex MacGillivray was a quadruple and arguably quintuple agent.
Holy shit. Who was he actually working for? The U.S.?
Publicly, he was working exclusively for the benefit of the Muskogee Nation. Privately, he was now receiving a $3,500 per year salary from the Spanish to act as their agent against the United States. And remember, this is 1790s money.
Guy's getting fucking paid.
$3,500 a year, 1790 to 2024 is, let's see, about $120,000 today.
So he's getting a 3-figure salary from the Spanish.
Yes. More privately, he was willing to cede quite a lot to the Americans, just not to the state of Georgia.
Sure.
Most privately, a bit of extra dirt on Alex MacGillivray was revealed to Thomas Jefferson over the course of their discussions in New York. Alex was a secret partner in Panton, Leslie and Company, a Scottish trading firm based out of the British colonies in the Bahama, and he had been for his entire adult life. This first really manifested in Muskogee politics way back in 1784 during his negotiations with Spain, when Spain was preparing to evict a PLC trader out of West Florida. Quoting from Claudio Sanz again, Charles McClatchy wrote to the Spanish governor, "Mr. McGillivray has a partial interest with us in the Indian trade. I have communicated to him the contents of your letter on this matter." McGillivray warned that the Muskogee would take up arms to save McClatchy's general store. Following the treaty negotiations, Alex wrote back to McClatchy, "They had too much concern for the peace and well-vein of the Floridas not to guard carefully against making us their enemy."
So he threatened to go to war with the Spanish to keep the company that he was vested in doing business in Florida.
To keep one representative of that company in Florida. They had other offices.
Oh my God. My man was operating on levels.
Oh, in subsequent negotiations with Spain, Georgia, and the U.S. federal government, Alex always favored the company over any other party. After torpedoing the Shoulder Bone Conference, he bragged to his superiors that he had avoided treaty terms that were less favorable to their business interests.
Oh my God. This man working deep for that dollar.
In the Treaty of New York, he made sure there were special secret carve-outs to exempt Panton, Leslie, and Company from import taxes and to grant them a monopoly over imports from Spain's Florida colonies to the United States. However, to quote the acclaimed Shakespeare of our time, Lin-Manuel Miranda, Alex just wanted to be in the room where it happens. Which is weird considering the main character of that play is also an Alex.
Yeah, he just wanted to be important.
Yeah, he was first and foremost loyal to himself. And that too can be seen in the Treaty of New York, where Alex secured a $100,000 payment in 1790s money for himself as compensation for his loyalist father's plantations that were seized by the Americans during the War for Independence.
Oh my, dude's getting reparations from his seized plantation.
And a secret position as a brigadier in the United States Army that came with a $1,500 per year salary.
I'll sign this treaty if you make me part of your army, and by that I mean you just give me a salary and I don't have to do anything.
He walked out of Federal Hall in New York as the generally recognized leader of the Muskogee, a well-paid agent of a British trading company, with $100,000 up front from the federal government, and $5,000 a year from his secret positions in the Spanish and American militaries.
You're right, he is Talleyrand.
This motherfucker colonized himself. Oh, and just as a cherry on top, he's been dealing with health complications from syphilis this entire time. Because it is 1790.
Oh my. Oh man, this is a wheeler and a dealer.
Yeah, you don't expect that getting through the story, and it's like, and he fought for his people, and he fought for his people, and he fought for his people, and he was an agent of a fucking fur trading company.
Agent of multiple foreign governments.
Yeah, he's got 4 different governments paying his salary in here.
Yeah, the Muskogee and the Spanish and the Americans and the British. True world citizen.
Fortunately for everyone involved, Alex fell ill over Christmas of 1791 and would never fully recover. Initially, he retired to one of his father's old plantations, valued at several million 1790s dollars, and after getting sick, he moved to Pensacola, became a Freemason, and lingered on for another 2 years. Just barely long enough to start seeing tension between Georgia and the Muskogee rise again. Eventually, his corpse was buried at one of his plantations called Choctaw Bluff, but initially, his corpse was buried in William Panton's backyard, as in Panton, Leslie, and Company. I have to assume it's like a large green estate, but the book did refer to it as his backyard.
I just bury my business partner out back.
Right? That is some Donald Trump shit.
Yeah, it's like that's what Trump did. Well, that's what Trump did to like his first wife.
With his wife?
Yeah, he just like buried her out back at the golf course.
I have to assume Alex McGillivray's grave was just as overgrown after a year.
I assume so.
By the time he died, both the Muskogee and the Seminoles in Florida, who had long provided refuge to escaped slaves, had come to recognize their longtime figurehead as a traitor, just in time for the opening of the Second Oconee War. I will cover that one some other time, but we are now at the end of the very first war, so far as I can tell, fought by U.S. armed forces against another nation, the Muskogee Confederacy. Asha, your thoughts?
Well, the U.S. government didn't win.
No!
That one.
That's the fucking thing!
They didn't win, and honestly, to me anyway, the federal government actually comes out of it in a better light than like the state of Georgia.
Absolutely. I would consider this an effective loss.
Yeah, they lost, but they extended federal authority while like getting a group of people who were legitimately threatening the stability of the southern end of the colonies. They managed to put that to rest so they could focus on the other wars that were going on, while, again, literally buying off the guy that was in charge of this effective military. And they lost the war, but still sort of won, if you're the federal government.
Yeah. And they hadn't had any part in starting this war because Articles of Confederation. So...
Yeah, no, the Georgians did that all by themselves. It is... The final thing I did want to mention, though, is I think it's interesting the way to think about how like that the New York Treaty then set up how they would deal with indigenous nations going forward, because that distinction of being under federal authority but not state authority is one that 100% has continued and continues to this day. If like the reservations and like native land in the U.S. now has that distinction where they are under U.S. federal government authority, but not state authority, and have their own police forces and their own like sort of, like implementation of the laws. They're like sort of independent states within the states that they're in. And that is wild that's a hangover from this New York Treaty, from 1780 something.
And Alex McGilvray negotiated that provision into the treaty because it gave him authority over the fur trade.
Yes. To go on like what people's popular conceptions. And then now that is now the authority under which, like for something local to me, the Ho Chunk Nation is able to have massive casinos in a state where otherwise you don't do gambling.
Yeah. The same treaty also established the rules for unincorporated territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands.
Which we definitely still have.
It set up the rules for two massive parts of U.S. territorial control for the rest of the nation's history.
And it was because of like a quadruple agent who just wanted to be rich.
Yeah. Yeah, that was his whole deal in the end. Now, obviously, this didn't last for very long because Georgia hated this deal.
Oh, yeah.
So they convinced Militia General Elijah Clark to take soldiers in 1792 across the Oconee River once again, occupy the territory in force, and declare themselves the independent Trans-Oconee Republic.
Oh, so we're doing this again.
Yeah, right. We will get to that another time. But this peace with the federal government would have held if Georgia could just let it go. But they demanded this swath of territory.
Well, yeah, because they had to build the Atlanta Braves Stadium and the University of Georgia.
The state of Georgia drove this process, just like it happened on a state level for most of the first 20 or 30 years of American history.
Well, see, they really needed to build Atlanta so that it could get burnt down in 100 years, 70 years.
Well, you know, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, we also don't want to go down that. We don't want to go down that path, though, because we don't want to talk about what General Sherman did with indigenous peoples after the Civil War.
No.
So
he was a Civil War era general. That means he is a terrible person who had the chance to do one good thing and he took it.
he thankfully did take that one, but none of the rest of them. But no, I had no idea about that. Thank you so much. I now have way more context in a bad way for Atlanta, for like Georgia and Atlanta racism, and for our nation's angle for dealing with indigenous peoples generally. So, thanks for that.
You're welcome. That is part of what I am striving for here, is more context for immense numbers of terrible things.
Reasons to hate the University of Georgia.
Yeah,
fantastic.
If you go to a school that has a rivalry with the University of Georgia, rub it in their fucking faces.
I mean, you can. I would be careful to first double check what your school started out where, because that might backfire on you. But hey, because most of their rivals are also in the SEC, so I would be a little worried.
Well, nobody said it wasn't going to be hypocritical. If we were avoiding hypocrisy, this podcast couldn't exist.
I mean, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Well, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yes, of course. Do you want to plug your stuff?
Sure. If you want to hear me pretend to know things, you can follow my podcast, which is Swords, Sorcery, and Socialism. We are a literature podcast who reads fantasy and sci-fi books and then talk about the politics that are either obvious or hidden inside of them. There's a lot of times what the author is trying to get across to you, and there's a lot of times the author gets across to you some stuff that I don't think they even knew they were putting in their book. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about. So if you like fantasy and sci-fi books, you check us out.
All right. And I will put a call to action here when I have done stuff like buy a URL.
Yeah. Just like doing the insert my website here.
Hello, this is Trevor from the future again. I do hope you enjoyed the first couple of episodes of America's Secret Wars. And if you want more information about that, you can find it online at secretwarspod.com or hopfulmedia.com. That's HOPFULMEDIA. You can also find me on social media at the old History of Persia usernames, because I'm not going to manage 2 accounts, and I'm not going to pretend like I'll try. If you do want to support this show and my other projects on Patreon, you can do that now at patreon.com/historyofpersia. But fair warning, I will be making some big changes to how all of that works in the very near future. And of course, this is a new podcast, so please, please, please review the show on your podcast app of choice. And if you are listening to this on the History of Persia feed, please go subscribe. Until next time, thank you for listening, and I don't know, go defend some forests in north central Georgia. Bye.